East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lo Kui Su. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China looking to score diplomatic and strategic points amid tariff turmoil. President Xi Jinping taking in 3 Southeast Asian countries in 5 days. As the new U.S. ambassador to Japan warns of an assertive China that would require alignment on defense, George Glass also upbeat on a deal being reached on tariffs. The U.S. unveils new port fees on Chinese-built and operated ships, fanning fears the move to revive American shipbuilding could further drive up trade tensions. Beijing denying supplying weapons to Moscow for use in its war on Kiev. Ukraine's leader accusing China of not just providing, but also producing arms in Russia. And also on East Asia Tonight, Japan's population has slumped for the 14th year running, while the birth rate has plunged to an all-time low. Can authorities do anything to address this chronic decline? And a ceasefire between Myanmar's military government and a key opposition group extended. CNA's Major Ishida speaks to a major Japanese non-profit to find out what this could mean in getting aid to people in need. The Chinese president officially wrapping up a 5-day tour of Southeast Asia, the trip viewed by many as a bid to shore up ties in the face of tensions over trade with the United States. In Cambodia, Mr. Xi held talks with the king and the queen mother at the palace, in addition to meetings with Prime Minister Hun Manet. He signed 37 agreements covering investments, trade and education, and promised to deepen a, quote, ironclad friendship.
中间的铁杆友谊拥有深厚的历史积淀，牢固的政治基础，强大的内生动力。
Before arriving in Cambodia, the Chinese president was in Malaysia, where he hailed what he called a new golden age of relations between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Xi and Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim oversaw the signing of more than 30 agreements, including deals on railway and aviation cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as partnerships in tech such as artificial intelligence and energy. Both sides in a joint statement rejecting unilateral measures, including arbitrary tariff hikes that they say are inconsistent with World Trade Organization rules. While in Vietnam, Mr. Xi called on leaders to oppose what he called Washington's unilateral bullying. Both China and Vietnam also signing multiple agreements on trade and supply chains, including plans to build new railway links between the two nations. The Chinese leader calling his state visit to Vietnam rich in activities and fruitful in outcomes. He expressed confidence in the development of ties between the two communist countries, with both keen to promote strategic cooperation and reaffirming an intention to advance the global socialist cause. And for more, we speak to Chong Jia-in. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Thanks for joining us, Professor Chong. He's also a non-resident scholar of Carnegie, China. Professor Chong, if I can list that, 45 deals, let's call them very roughly deals in Vietnam, 31 in Malaysia, 37 in Cambodia. These are very loosely MOUs or agreements, letters or statements of intent. If you add them all up, that's 113 in just 5 days. In diplomatic terms, is this a big deal?
So the numbers themselves, they are a demonstration that the PRC has lots of support behind it, that it's got neighbors behind its cause. I think that's the main point. However, memoranda of understanding, which most of these arrangements are, they're non-binding. The statements of intent, and both Beijing and also various ASEAN member states like to put forth memoranda of understanding. They create an impression that there is forward movement. However, these memoranda of understanding sometimes drop by the wayside, sometimes implementation is not followed up. So Whether that actually translates into anything concrete, I think we'll have to see. I mean, Malaysia has set up a council to try to coordinate among the very many MOUs. So we'll see what happens.
All right. So this is, in a way, it's symbolic, it's strategic, it's an easy win for both sides, and it certainly sounds very good. Suggestions now that Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia, these were almost the perfect targets that the Chinese president could have chosen had he known that we would be in the tariff turmoil we are in right now. Of course, these trips, they are months in the planning, but even so, it's opportune for him, is it not?
Of course. I mean, these locations for Secretary General Xi's visit, I mean, clearly there are places that are not going to do anything that will embarrass him. They're going to show a lot of enthusiasm for his visits. And so I think these were why the locations were chosen. I think also you're right that the visits were months in planning. But I think from what I understand, the PRC government had been thinking through what could happen in the face of a trade war with the United States. It may not have gotten everything right, but trying to shore up allies and friends and so on. That's something that had been in the works at least since November, if not earlier.
Professor Chung, it's easy to call something an ironclad friendship. It's easy to be friends if it doesn't hurt you. But if both sides hit by heavy tariffs now need to find alternatives for their exports, looking to each other, both with issues of their own, who is going to be providing more of an ironclad friendship to each other, ASEAN or China?
So that's a really great question. I think at this point, no one really knows. That economic relationship between the two sides, they do have certain underlying, I guess, areas of concern. So, for instance, for a long time, what the states in Southeast Asia tend to do is that they produce and they sell to the PRC. And those items then get assembled and sold further on to final markets in the US, Europe, and so on. With the tariffs, then you see that US market drying up. The Chinese domestic market has been suffering from low consumption for a long time. The PRC government has been trying to fix it for a while. They've not been able to. So that means that the PRC market can't really absorb all the goods that Southeast Asia might be selling to the PRC. Conversely, as we see trade diversion because of the essential closure of the US market to PRC goods, there will be a search by PRC firms for alternative markets. And that could lead to oversupply, overcapacity coming to the shores of Southeast Asia. This had already been something of concern last year, but small and medium-sized enterprises, but also governments will find that their industries may not be able to produce the goods as competitively or as cheaply as Chinese goods, and that could create a lot of domestic pressure. And that's one area with the sort of lowering demand. The FDI will be hit for Southeast Asia and possibly for the PRC as well. And there are these lingering territorial disputes and lingering riverine disputes for mainland Southeast Asia. So these things could potentially come to a head. How the supposed ironclad relationship holds under these circumstances, I think, remain to be seen.
I think coming to a head, we can take that for granted. These things similarly never quite go away. With this code of conduct, there were some analysts ahead of this visit thinking this visit might be a chance to actually make some substantial progress on talking about that code of conduct in the South China Sea. We didn't see any mention of that, did we?
Right. This visit was interesting in that every point of contention between Beijing and the various capitals were just put aside. There was no real mention of the code of conduct, territorial disputes, of, as I mentioned, the sort of disputes along the rivers, which would affect Vietnam and Cambodia, with damming upstream. And there's also no mention of the scam groups, lots of these areas where there has been tension between various capitals and Beijing. They were just left off. I think that's intentional. It's intended to show a solidarity. It's intended to show support for each other in the face of tariffs by the United States.
So a final question here, Professor Chong. So the naval base you mentioned, as well as that Funan Techno Canal, these have met the highly politicized issues, and they have disrupted relations between Cambodia and Vietnam. And you would think China might be the third party that might be the one to step up and make sure that these two learn to get along over what's happening in the Mekong. Again, no sign of that. What does this suggest in terms of China's relations with these countries in Southeast Asia? Final question.
Absolutely. So that the techno canal, and also the Ream naval base, these are areas of contention for Cambodia and its neighbors. But the canal in particular between Vietnam and Cambodia. Now these are really tricky, difficult issues to deal with, and the fact that I didn't mention any of these at all, I suppose, is an effort to sort of shunt aside for the moment the more difficult issues and to raise to the forefront all the sort of easier demonstrations of friendship. So I guess the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we'll have to see what happens when these issues come up again. They inevitably do. They subside for a while. They come back again, as you noted. So when they do, how the ironclad relationship works, whether there are any modifications to the MOUs, etc., those are things to watch.
Our thanks to Associate Professor Chong Jia-yen from the National University of Singapore. The new U.S. ambassador to Japan says he's extremely optimistic a deal can be reached on tariffs. George Glass speaking after Japanese tariff envoys met U.S. officials in Washington to negotiate steep levies imposed by the White House. He described those talks as, quote, very successful. Japan is hoping for a review of not just the 25% on auto imports already in effect, but also of a separate 24% duty that is at this point on pause. And there's, of course, also that 10% baseline tariff slapped on most countries. Japanese companies are among the biggest investors in America, and Tokyo serves as a vital ally on security and defense for Washington in its Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. president says Washington is in talks with China on tariffs, hinting there could soon be a deal. But Donald Trump not confirming if he has spoken directly with his Chinese counterpart.
I would think over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I think maybe the whole thing could be concluded. You have to understand, we're a big, if you think of us as a big, beautiful department store before that business was destroyed by the internet. We're a big, beautiful store. And everybody wants a piece of that store. China wants it, Japan wants it, Mexico, Canada, they live off it, those two. Without us, they wouldn't have a country.
But Mr. Trump indicated China had been in touch since the imposition of tariffs. Reuters reports that while the two sides are in contact, what is missing are high-level, free-flowing talks that would be needed to strike any kind of deal. There are no signs yet from China on the kind of top-level talks that Mr. Trump claims they are having. Beijing, meanwhile, has kept up the diplomatic pressure, with Foreign Minister Wang Yi today calling out Washington's, quote, unilateral bullying, while addressing diplomats and scholars from developing countries. 3 U.S. senators are in Taiwan this week in what is the first visit by American lawmakers since President Donald Trump took office. They are scheduled to meet President William Lai as well as the island's defense chief. China has previously responded harshly to such interactions between Taiwan and U.S. officials, which they view the island as its territory. The U.S. senators told reporters their visit shows there is bipartisan support for Taiwan's defense, despite harsh words and tariffs from President Trump. Republican Senator Pete Ricketts and Democrat Chris Coons are both on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's East Asia subgroup.
The United States can continue something that began under the previous administration and is extending under this administration and has strong bipartisan support, which is connecting Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, Korea, weaving together regional partners and allies.
Look past the rhetoric and look at the action. Secretary Hegseth came out here very early this administration to talk about the importance of allies and what we're going to do to be able to support them. You look at, again, that when it came to the pauses, the Philippines, Taiwan, they were not impacted by those. When you look at, for example, these trade negotiations, Taiwan is engaging already with the administration. So I think it's been very clear that the administration is making this a priority.
Still ahead on East Asia tonight, the IMF sees a notable slowdown in growth, but no recession as tariffs create a new normal for the world economy. And a seismic shift in the mindset for Japanese consumers regarding their staple rice is in the making. We'll tell you what's triggering that. It's time for business news with Roland. Roland, the Trump administration moving ahead with plans to impose fees on Chinese-built ships docking in U.S. ports.
That's right, Wei Su. And the move is aimed at reviving the country's collapsed shipbuilding sector and challenge China's dominance of the industry. But experts say the move could further ratchet up trade tensions between the two economies at a time when global trade is already being disrupted by Donald Trump's trade tariffs. Under the new rules, ships will be charged at each voyage to the U.S. and not for each port of call, as proposed in the earlier plan. The fee will be assessed only up to 5 times per year and can be waived if the owner places an order for a U.S.-built vessel. Now, there will be separate fees for Chinese-operated ships and Chinese-built ships, and both will gradually increase over subsequent years. Starting in 6 months, Chinese owners and operators will be charged $50 a ton for each U.S. voyage. Now, this fee will increase by $30 a ton each year for the next 3 years. Chinese-built ship owned by non-Chinese firms will be charged $18 a ton or $120 a container. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office says all non-U.S. built ships carrying cars will be charged $150 per vehicle. Now, ships that arrive empty at U.S. ports to pick up bulk cargoes are exempted. The move stems from a probe launched under the prior administration that found that China was involved in unfair trade practices in the maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors. Experts say the announcement came as global trade is already being disrupted. Now, cargoes originally destined for ports in the U.S. from China are instead being redirected to European ports. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has slammed the action, saying that it will hurt U.S. consumers and businesses, in addition to disrupting global supply chains, which is also failing to revitalize the U.S. shipbuilding industry. The IMF is warning of global trade disruptions on account of U.S. tariffs. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva says that the fund expects notable cuts to its growth outlook, but doesn't foresee a recession.
Our new growth projections will include notable markdowns, but not recession. We will also see markups to the inflation forecasts for some countries. We will caution that protracted high uncertainty raises the risk of financial market stress.
In January, the fund projected the global economy would grow 3.3% both this year and next. It is now expected to pare back that outlook. The fund's World Economic Report is due next week at the spring meetings, which the IMF co-hosts with the World Bank. Ms. Georgieva has called on all countries to gradually adjust their fiscal policies to lower debt levels and to maintain what she described as an agile and credible monetary policy. Japan's core inflation accelerated last month on the back of rising food costs. The data comes ahead of the Bank of Japan's policy meeting at the end of this month. Headline inflation came in at 3.6% in March, with the core rate, which excludes fresh food, at 3.2%. It is now 3 years since inflation is above the central bank's 2% target. Despite this, the central bank governor says the Bank of Japan will continue with its plans to raise interest rates based on its forecast. However, the country's GDP could face downward pressure as tariffs loom on the horizon, limiting the bank's room to hike rates.
Meantime, Japan is facing an unexpected crisis, a severe rice shortage that's driving prices to record highs and shaking up everything from home kitchens to what's happening at trade talks. And Roland, news today, wholesale rice prices in Japan falling for the first time in 8 months in March, but supermarket prices, now those climbed for the 14th straight week in the 7 days to the 6th of April. Why?
Right. It really is a perfect storm that was brewing. Extreme heat, damaged last year's crops. We have inflation pushing up production costs. And then you have Japan receiving record numbers of tourists also consuming rice. So wholesale prices domestically, for domestic rice, I should say, is up 70%. That's just the latest figures. But if you compare on a 12-month basis, it's up 70%, and at the supermarkets, it's more than doubled. And that's prompted the government earlier to release some 210,000 metric tons from its emergency reserves to actually quell this surge in prices. But still, we're seeing supermarkets, rice packets still, flying off the shelves.
So that 210,000 metric tons of rice somehow did not make it onto the shelves enough to defray costs for customers.
Well, many people allude to the fact that the government has reassured to say that on paper that amount is there, but on the shelves at supermarkets it's not felt. This could possibly be due to logistics supply bottlenecks. It could be also, and don't forget, with the prices of rice rising, there is also that rationale that when people see a surge in prices, they want to stockpile and therefore buy more than they need, and therefore also raise prices higher than they should be at. So that's also another reason for
triggering some sort of unfortunate vicious cycle. We are hearing anecdotally, I think there were reports on restaurants switching to using rice. I mean, Japanese people, I think you are quite gourmet, so you would be aware of that. Very particular, especially about rice. But now they're not averse to eating rice from another country.
No, that is a significant shift in mindset of the Japanese. As you mentioned, there was a quite well-known restaurant that made the headlines recently, and they were using American Calrose rice, which is cheaper than the local strain. But more importantly, apparently his diners couldn't tell the difference, so he's not switching back. And then we have also big supermarket chains like Aeon and Seiyu. They're offering imported rice on their shelves. Then they're also offering a mix. Aeon, for example, has an 80-20 mix, 80% US, 20% Japanese rice, which is actually about 10% cheaper than if you were to buy local rice. So it's a real mindset change, because if you remember back in '93, when Japan faced a similar crisis with rice, they imported Thai rice and it was left on the shelves. Nobody wanted it. But now, obviously, things have changed.
So there was resistance then, but with times change as well, and all this talk, I'm sure your days are made very uncertain by this tariff war, and Donald Trump bringing up, as it turned out, a challenged figure on Japanese tariffs on rice imports. So that's become part of this quarrel on tariffs.
Yeah, just as U.S.-Japan trade negotiations are underway, Trump has weighed in saying that, hey, look, Japan's is imposing 700% tax on imported rice. Well, Japanese officials have said it's not exactly true. He hasn't actually got it right. I mean, it's more like several 100%. And the reason why he got his figure was because he actually based it on the effective levy on rice, whereas trade deals and the tax on rice is actually based on the weight of rice. It doesn't take into account whether rice prices, wholesale rice prices go up or down. So that's the reason for that. But as you said, it will be used as a bargaining chip, and it does have Tokyo officials on the back foot of that.
Dubious as these calculations are, they are, for example, reciprocal tariffs, we're looking at the way they were calibrated. Lots of questions being hurled in that direction. Thanks so much for joining us, explaining the rice crisis. Roland Lim there. And still ahead on East Asia tonight, Japan reporting a record plunge in its population this week. Is there any way to substantially reverse this decline? We speak to one expert in just a moment. Well, this is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The Chinese president officially wrapping up a 5-day tour of Southeast Asia. The trip viewed by many as a bid to shore up ties in the face of tensions over trade with the United States. The new U.S. ambassador to Japan warning of an assertive China that would require alignment on defense. George Glass also upbeat on a deal being reached on tariffs. The U.S. unveils new port fees on Chinese-built and operated ships, fanning fears the move to revive American shipbuilding could further drive up trade tensions. The head-spinning tit-for-tat rounds of tariffs between the US and China have triggered alarming headlines around the world. But what is it like for businesses on the ground who have to live with those tariffs? CNA's Tan Yuguan meets with the furniture maker in China.
Simon Lichtenberg is a Danish entrepreneur. He has been in the business of making sofas in China since 1997. And the US has long been his most important market.
Europe, you have Holland, France, Belgium, they have different tastes and preferences. So in the US, it's much more uniform, and the customers are much bigger. So you can do a lot of volume with one customer, which you cannot do in other markets.
The first Trump administration slapped the first set of tariffs on Chinese-made imports to the US as early as 2018. Since then, Simon has been making plans to deal with tariffs as high as 60%. For them to go way over that came as a complete surprise.
More than half of our production is made in China for the US. Oh, I would say was. And that production has come to a complete halt.
The contrast is clear in Simon's factory in Jiaxing in Zhejiang province, about 2 hours' drive from Shanghai. While some floors catering to the European and Asian markets are a hive of activity, those floors catering to the American market are ghostly silent. Furniture and bedding is third among exports that China ships to the United States. That's behind electricals and mechanical parts and appliances. As production lines making those products shut down, layoffs are certainly on the cards. The question is, to what extent? Some watchers say, as an employer in China, the manufacturing of goods is no longer as dominant as it used to be.
Services actually make up 60% of China's employment nowadays. So manufacturing is important, but manufacturing is not that important compared with like 10, 20 years ago. And the furniture is, of course, a labor-intensive industry. Many will see some layoff. China's labor cost is going to rise anyway. China is facing higher US tariffs than many other countries. So in this situation, the labor-intensive industries exporting to the US, such as the furniture, is probably the best for them to consider relocation to ASEAN countries.
Indeed, to deal with the US tariffs, Simon is quadrupling his production in Vietnam and Mexico. But he insists that China remains a cost-effective place to make labor-intensive products like sofas compared to other countries, despite rising wages.
Because the efficiency is higher, the supply chain is better, the components cost are lower, the transportation is more efficient. So it is cheaper to make it in China today than it is in Vietnam, something like 10-15%. And in our case, we have been able to keep the labor cost as a percentage of the final product price constant over the last 15 years, even though the hourly pay per worker has doubled. So that just shows the efficiency has improved so much. And the components have been, same also for the components have been cheaper and cheaper.
So while he's cutting payroll and laying off workers, Simon is trying to keep as many of his skilled workers as possible, such as his upholsterers. Like previous rounds of tariffs, prior to rolling out mitigating policies, authorities have reached out to entrepreneurs like Simon for data on the impact. In the short run, Simon hopes Chinese authorities will lean on banks to dish out low-interest loans to keep the cash flow going. But in the long run,
5 years ago, when the Trump 1.0 added tariffs on China, we decided to diversify our sales, and we have done that with some success. This last year was a 30% up on non-US sales, and this year will probably be 50% up on last year.
Tan Yuguan, CNA, Jiaxing, Zhejiang province.
China has dismissed an accusation by the Ukrainian president that it is supplying arms to Moscow in its war in Ukraine. Beijing says that claim is groundless and it has never made lethal weapons available to any party in that conflict. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also says it's committed to promoting a ceasefire and is encouraging peace talks. Mr. Zelenskyy, that's Ukraine's president, on Thursday accusing China for the first time of directly providing military assistance to Moscow. He says his government has evidence and will be sharing more details.
Не те, що ви здивовані, але дійсно не хотілося бачити відповідні факти, які ми бачили, які я бачив. Тому що все ж таки була у мене розмова з китайським лідером під час цієї війни, і я ставив пряме запитання щодо зброї. Він мені дав слово, що зброю продавати і відправляти в Росію не буде. Але, на жаль, ми бачимо зараз іншу інформацію. В будь-якому випадку у нас вже є факти про цю роботу Китаю і Росії на посилення їх обороноздатності. І це погані факти.
Mr. Zelenskyy revealing last week that Ukraine had captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting for Russia on the battlefield. He said about 155 Chinese citizens are believed to be fighting with Moscow's troops against Kyiv. U.S. officials have said they believe the Chinese citizens are mercenaries who do not appear to have any direct link to the Chinese government in Beijing. Japan's population decline weighing heavier on the minds of government officials after recent figures show the number of citizens and residents hitting a record low for the 14th year running. Policymakers in Asia's second largest economy have tried to address this issue over the years, but with little success. Japan saw its steepest on-year decline in population in 2024 by nearly 900,000. The population as of last October stands at just over 120 million. Its birth rate is one of the lowest in the world. This comes against a backdrop of its rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce. Many are putting off marriage and parenthood, citing insecurity over jobs and less desire to have babies amid a shift in social values. The government says it's trying to raise wages and to boost child allowances to encourage people to have families. While the society is becoming more accepting of young foreigners as a source of labor, Japan still maintains a relatively stringent policy on immigration. This has consequences for Social Security. Government research pointing to national pensions falling 30%, with a smaller workforce supporting more elderly. That could be sharper if birth rates should fall even faster. And more, let's bring in Professor Hiroshi Yoshida from the Research Center for Aged Economy and Society at Tohoku University in Japan. Thanks for joining us, Professor. I've got those figures, but independently, you have carried out your own research. In fact, you have your own demography clock, which is your version of the doomsday clock. And by this simulation, you have suggested that in 695 years, the whole of Japan will have just one person aged below 14 if current trends continue.
Yes, certainly. So that is a kind of mechanical calculation, not that the true future forecast, but I made this clock to boost the people's concentration to anti-low fertility policy.
All right, it's still fairly dire. It's just hard to imagine just the one person aged below 14 in 695 years. If that is the case, and your figures suggest that this is a very real possibility, are you seeing policies right now addressing what would otherwise be a certainty in those few hundred years?
Yes. Japanese government tried to boost the fertility with many policies, but I don't think it's very effective. So I think based on my calculation, the possibility of the one child in Japan may occur with certain possibilities.
So what we mentioned, government trying to raise wages, boost child allowances, subsidize various things in the bid to encourage more people to get married, to have children. For example, Tokyo, the government there trying to use apps to encourage people to date and therefore presumably get married after that and presumably again have children after that. These for you, these are random moves that do not show commitment to a very serious purpose of encouraging people to have more children.
Yes, but in Japan, the marriage and making children is very related, deeply related. Almost all people in Japan have the children after marriage. So boosting such kind of the marriage encouragement and child allowance may be a possibility to boost the fertility, but I don't think that it does not have the decisive effect. So the trend of declining children and declining old people in Japan will continue.
So what's decisive for you?
Yes.
What would decisive be for you?
Yes, decisive. My opinion, decisive is gives not. I think it is good to give the money to younger couple to make children, but I think that they need not only money but also sufficient time to care children. So I think that the government to prepare have the much maternity leave to them.
I think you've called this, your theory is child rearing moratorium, essentially shifting around supplies of time and labor so that an increasingly large older population in Japan works so that the younger generation can enjoy, for you, the pleasures of child rearing.
Yes, so Japan's future is the birth rate falling and expanding longevity is simultaneously occurring. So with expanded longevity, they work in old age and using that labor supply, so younger couple can have the maternity leave and have the plenty of time to child care. So that is a kind of time shifting in their life, like the using a time machine and all the time of old age carry back to the young age. So that is my new idea.
A final question, Professor. I think because in your research you said loosening immigration laws might not solve the problem for Japan because even if you let in younger people from other countries, those other countries, and you have looked at them, they have their own demographic problems and they themselves need to keep their young people in their own countries to look after their own old people. So this is a global problem. We are seeing, apart from sub-Saharan Africa, every country, most continents are seeing demographic decline. More old people, fewer young people supporting them. It's a mindset thing. It's not just time and it's not just money. So anecdotally, how would you encourage people to want to have children? That's a problem that many policymakers face. Final question.
The answer is known only by God, but the sufficient system to prepare women to both working and child care is very important. And not only female, but also husband take part in child care in their home, especially it needs in East Asian countries.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Professor, for joining us looking at this demographic decline in Japan. We look beyond East Asia. The UN nuclear watchdog says Iran and the United States are running out of time to secure a deal as both sides prepare to hold fresh nuclear talks this weekend. Malaysia's leader Anwar Ibrahim says both Myanmar's military government and a key opposition group have agreed to extend a ceasefire to boost the flow of aid for the quake-struck nation. Mr. Anwar making that announcement after talks with the exiled opposition National Unity Government, or the NUG, and Myanmar's ruling military government in separate meetings. Malaysia currently holds the ASEAN chairmanship, Mr. Anwar adding that the outreach to both sides is part of regional efforts to engage all parties in the conflict and to push for a unified peace plan. The Malaysian leader earlier spoke with Myanmar's ruling military chief, Min Aung Hlaing, in Bangkok. He described those talks as frank and constructive in a Facebook post this morning. But critics and rights groups had condemned Mr. Anwar's meeting with Mr. Min, warning it could legitimize the military government. But a ceasefire in Myanmar is crucial to any effort to deliver aid to victims of that recent earthquake. This is according to the head of a major Japanese non-profit who was at ground zero. CNA's Michi Ishida tells us more.
The 7.7 magnitude earthquake that hit Myanmar on the 28th of March devastated the central cities of Mandalay and Sagaing, killing more than 3,600 people and leaving many more in desperate need of aid. The international community was swift to offer assistance, including Japanese non-profit group Nippon Foundation. Its chairman, Yohei Sasakawa, who is also Japan's special envoy for national reconciliation in Myanmar, met Myanmar's army chief, Min Aung Hlaing, in Naypyidaw on the 2nd of April to discuss relief efforts. The foundation pledged $3 million in aid, including food and medical supplies. Mr. Sasakawa, who visited quake-hit areas, says people were living on the street as temperatures hit 40 degrees Celsius.
蚊が多いですからね、蚊帳が必要なことと、それから下はマットもいいですけども、ゴザの方が通気性があっていいので、至急手配をしようということになってます。
Myanmar has been torn by strife since a military coup in 2021. Mr. Sasakawa says a ceasefire is critical in ensuring that supplies reach the people, but thinks that for a truce to be effective, Myanmar's ethnic armed groups must be on board.
20の少数民族間でも戦いが一部ございまして、全てが一致して国軍と戦っているわけではないんです。戦闘地域を通らないと援助物資が送れない場所もございます。
The Japanese government does not recognize the Myanmar military regime. Following the quake, it has announced a $6 million emergency grant, which will be channeled to victims through international organizations. It has also sent a medical team to Myanmar. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
More CNA's coverage on the earthquake. Do head over to our website, cna.asia, and our mobile app for updates, including this documentary titled Myanmar in Turmoil, which captures the immediate aftermath of the devastating disaster. The US and Iran are preparing to hold fresh nuclear talks this weekend. Reports say Israel had plans to strike Iranian nuclear sites as soon as next month. But that was waved off by President Donald Trump, who was in favor of negotiating a deal to limit Tehran's nuclear program. The chief of the UN nuclear watchdog, meantime, has warned that Tehran is not far from producing a nuclear bomb. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, was given the task of overseeing Iran's nuclear program and its compliance with the 2015 deal. That deal collapsed when the US withdrew during President Trump's first term.
What is important is that we play a constructive role. For some, what one says may sometimes be good or sometimes not be so sufficiently good. The important thing is that there is an honest effort here on our part to keep the integrity of the effort to be at the service of countries that have serious differences and are trying to solve them in a diplomatic way.
Observers say there is still significant debate within Mr. Trump's team about what kind of agreement with Iran would be acceptable. Trent Murray has more from Tel Aviv.
Well, both here in Israel and across the Middle East, these talks will be closely watched given the implications they could have for both security and stability across the region. There was initially some confusion over just where these negotiations would take place. Iran had initially been pushing for the second round of negotiations to once again happen in Oman. However, we are hearing now that they have agreed instead to travel to the Italian capital, Rome, to meet with the US negotiators. And what is on the table is quite significant. It is the possibility of the US lifting or removing some of the raft of sanctions currently placed on Iran if the US can be satisfied that the Iranians are enriching uranium for peaceful purposes and are not using it to try and build a nuclear weapon. We have heard from the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, however, that these talks are now at a crucial stage. Their independent estimates suggest that right now Iran has reached uranium enrichment purity levels of around 60%, but are on their way to the 90% that is needed in order to make a nuclear weapon. Of course, for Israel, they will be acutely interested in what takes place at these talks. In fact, we have heard some reporting from the New York Times in recent days suggesting that during his recent visit to Washington to meet with President Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushed for the US to take military action instead against Iran, pushing aside the idea of a diplomatic solution and suggesting that only military airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities would, in his view, solve the problem. But that same reporting suggests that President Trump did push back against this idea. He wants to give some space to a possible diplomatic solution. However, we also know that the US is increasing its military force posture across this region. It has brought in additional air defense systems. It is placing long-range bombers at US bases here, and it is also increasing its naval force with an additional carrier strike group. It seems that while these negotiations takes place, the US wants to keep the military option on the table, and with it the risk of a much wider war potentially engulfing the Middle East. Trent Murray, CNA, Tel Aviv.
And that's East Asia Tonight headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, we're on Facebook and YouTube.